Part 19. I Can See the Laws of Things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 181. Boom. A loud noise. The sword blade in Lin An's hand swept directly towards him. The old man subconsciously mobilized all the blood in his body to block it, but the moment he came into contact with the pale sword blade, his expression changed drastically. He felt as if the weight of a planet had fallen on his arms. The blood energy he had gathered was instantly defeated by the blade, and his arm was crushed into pieces with a click. A shrill scream instantly resounded through the sky. His body instantly flew out like a cannonball under the huge impact, and finally hit the wall 100 meters away. This sudden scene made everyone in the airport stunned. Everyone looked at Lin, who was standing there. The next moment, the whole place screamed, people ran away in panic, and the scene instantly turned into chaos. The old man looked at his broken arms tremblingly. He suddenly raised his head, locked eyes with Lin An, and roared. "Who are you?" But Lin An didn't say a word. The next moment, the sword blade in his hand directly cut through the distance of several hundred meters between the two. Puff. At a speed that broke the sound barrier, the white sword in Lin An's hand penetrated directly through the old man's chest. Under the huge penetrating power, Lin's sword actually penetrated the ground behind him directly, and even penetrated directly into the ground to a depth of thousands of meters. The old man still maintained that stiff posture, and there was still huge disbelief in his eyes. He couldn't believe that the strength of his senior general was useless at this moment. Killing people, in the airport, people screamed and fled in all directions, and it was already in chaos. Lin strode towards the corpse whose chest was penetrated. His eyes swept across the corpse's face, and then he stretched out his hand. A sonorous sound. The white blade that penetrated thousands of meters into the ground instantly penetrated the soil and fell into his hand. The first one. He turned around immediately, his eyes not even lingering on the corpse. What no one could see was that the moment the old man died, his soul turned into a stream of blue light and was absorbed by the unicorn jade heart in Lin An's chest. The spiritual power a high-level town will bring is considerable. The next moment, Lin turned around and strode towards the other side. In the control room, Wang Qingyuan was already in huge shock. Others may not see it clearly, but he can see it clearly on the monitor. He didn't even see how powerful Lin An was. After he knocked back the senior town general with one sword, he took his life with the second sword. There is no sloppiness, no bells and whistles. How is this possible? Wang Qingyuan gasped. Even he himself was shocked by Lin An's strength. His impression of Lin still remained when he killed the 5th level insect mother. Although the 5th level insect mother is indeed very powerful, compared with those who are truly at the top, it can still only be regarded as a bug in the swamp. But how much time has passed? From that time to now, only a few months have passed. Is Lin now able to easily crush the senior generals? Following Lin An's action, the entire airport was now in chaos. In another part of the airport, an old man with scars on his face suddenly turned his head and looked in the direction of the hall. A huge uneasiness suddenly came into his heart. Old Bai, the young man beside him, frowned and turned around suddenly. Bai Lao said solemnly, "Don't worry, let's leave, and leave here." The next moment, he suddenly turned around and was about to rise into the sky. But at this moment, he instantly felt that he was locked by a huge energy. And the moment he felt the energy, a sharp sound of breaking through the air suddenly came from the air. His expression changed drastically, and he subconsciously dodged to the left. Poof! He couldn't dodge, and a pale sharp blade penetrated directly through his shoulder, nailing his body to the ground. Bai Lao, the young man, was shocked by the sudden scene. He immediately ran towards the old man. But at the next moment, he suddenly felt a strong wind coming from behind him. For a moment, he only felt a huge gust of wind coming from the sky. The next moment, a man wearing a dark robe crossed a distance of 800 meters and landed heavily in front of Bai Lao. The billowing cyclone blew the young man away in an instant. "Who are you?" the young man roared and got up. Bai Lao looked at the man so close with trembling eyes. The man looked down at him indifferently, and then suddenly grasped the white sword nailed to his shoulder. "What on earth are you?" Bai Lao's eyes were bloodshot and he stared at Lin En. But he only said half of what he said. With a pop, a deep blood mark appeared on his throat. In great shock, he opened his mouth, covering his throat and trying to breathe. But it has no effect at all. Lin punched him directly on the heart, and blood spattered for 5 steps. This scene made the young man collapse on the ground. He looked at Lin En, who was wearing a black robe, trembling and said, You. Lin En drew out his sword, turned his head, looked at him indifferently, and then walked towards him step by step. The huge sense of oppression was like facing a world. The young man was even directly oppressed by the aura emanating from Lin En, and his 7 orifices kept bleeding. Who is this person? The despair in the young man's eyes became more and more, even to the point of trembling. And the next moment, Lin En had come in front of him, and the huge shadow enveloped him completely. He even felt that breathing became a little difficult. The next moment, Lin En's sword suddenly stabbed at him, and he instantly closed his eyes and screamed. But at this moment, Lin En suddenly raised his head and squinted his eyes. His body instantly jumped 180 degrees to the back and landed heavily 100 meters away. At the moment when he closed the distance, dazzling rays of light fell from afar to the position where the young man was. Boom! That position exploded instantly, and the entire ground exploded in that blow, creating a huge deep pit. The next moment, 3 old men flew here from different directions. An old man suddenly jumped up 100 meters and landed heavily on the ground. The ground under his feet exploded instantly, and his clothes on his upper body exploded instantly, revealing his dry body, but his dry body was engraved with dense golden lines. "You killed Bai Bang," the old man with golden lines all over his body said fiercely with a fierce light in his eyes. "I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 182. The next moment, another old man slowly landed next to him. The old man was wearing a grey robe, with blue eyes dancing in his eyes. He seemed to be floating there without weight, and several blue will-o'-the-wisps burned instantly around his body. He squinted his eyes, stared at Lin En and said, "Are you here specifically to kill us? But we don't know you. I think you'd better give us a reasonable explanation before you die." As soon as he finished speaking, the space around him suddenly fluctuated, and a thin old man appeared there like an after-image. He was lying on the ground, holding a dagger with a poisonous light in his hand. "Man looks like a poisonous snake lurking in the grass. Why talk to him so much?" The old man narrowed his eyes and said, "Let's go together and kill him first." The wind howled by. The trembling crowd in the distance looked at the 4 people confronting each other in horror, especially the 3 old men. The aura emanating from them was so terrifying that it made people feel trembling in their hearts. But no one dared to underestimate that young man, because just now, he easily used the sword in his hand to kill 2 strong men who were definitely not inferior in strength. Lin En slowly raised his head, glanced at the 3 of them, and said slowly, "Lion King Jin Jingao, in order to save your people when his spiritual energy revived 100 years ago, he fought 3 top ferocious beasts on the grassland, killing 1 and injuring 2 others. He became famous in one battle. Later, after he achieved the position of god of war, he was revered as the Lion King. I'm right." The expression of the old man with golden lines engraved on his body changed, and he clenched his fists subconsciously. "Who the hell are you?" Lin En slowly turned his head, glanced at the old man suspended in the air, surrounded by will-o'-the-wisps, and said slowly, "The ghost wizard Shang Yongji, also 100 years ago, in the troubled times when evil beasts swept the entire world, slaughtered hundreds of thousands of evil beasts with one man's power, and abruptly changed the direction of the war at that time, Xiangyangji, you are also one of the first people to be called the savior, so you should be the one. The old man's narrowed eyes flashed with cold light. He didn't say anything, but his hands were already clenched unconsciously. Lin En turned his head again, looking at the figure that disappeared and appeared, like an old man who did not belong to this time and space, and said lightly. As for you, Viper, in the troubled times 100 years ago, not only did you not focus on the great cause of the human race, but you were immersed in assassinations and internal fighting. In the end, you were a criminal with a long history of crimes who was expelled from the entire Kyushu territory. Compared with them, you, on the contrary, it is more pure because you have no good thoughts in your heart from the beginning to the end. The old man's lips cracked into a sneer, and he said, it seems that you know a lot. Lin En hugged his shoulders and said calmly, I just feel a little pity, because you were all famous strong men in the Kyushu region, but now you are about to die in my hands. Don't you feel sad? Ghost Witch Xiangyangji narrowed his eyes and said, who are you? How do you know our identities? Lin En said indifferently, my name is Lin En. As for why I know your identities, there is no need for the dead to know so clearly. In an instant, Lin En waved his hand suddenly, holding the pale sword blade, and the sound of the sword echoed through the sky. The expressions of the three people changed instantly. Lin. Of course they know. During the great changes in the insect swarm a few months ago, the strongest of the younger generation single-handedly crushed the insect swarm. But they never expected that this person would actually stand in front of them at this moment. And in that very encounter, they killed two of their companions. The ghost wizard Xiangyangji suddenly raised his head and said gloomily, Lin En. I know you, what exactly do you mean? Now that you know that we are the saviors of the 9 provinces territory, you still dare to attack us. Do you want to fight with us? Is the entire Kyushu region an enemy? His eyes flickered because he realized that he couldn't see through Lin En's strength at all now. He stood there, like an abyss, which actually made him feel trembling. Lin En said calmly, if you were still the original group of saviors who risked their lives for the safety of the Kyushu territory, not only would I not kill you, but I would respect you, but it is very regrettable. It is you who have abandoned the honor of being the savior. Ever since you killed the woman who gave you strength, you have long since become an evil ghost wandering around the world. When they heard Lin say the words that woman, their faces changed. They understood everything instantly. Lin En said lightly, is it because you came to Qingcheng this time because you received news from the person named Ku? Did he tell you that he found the ancient land of the Xianlin people and told you that as long as you can unravel the relationship between them? So if you can live through the secret of an era, you will be able to live forever. As soon as these words came out, the expressions of the 3 old men changed again, and a fierce light burst out from their eyes. How could he know this? Could it be that? Xiangyangji suddenly stepped forward, gritted his teeth and said, I'm coaxing you. Lin En raised his head and said indifferently, it is very unfortunate that he has been killed by me, but you will see him soon. Lin said softly, of course, in hell. The Lion King suddenly let out a roar that could tear a person's eardrums toward the sky, and his body expanded several times in an instant. Stop talking nonsense to him, kill him. The next moment, he stepped on the ground and rushed towards Lin En. Every step he took, the ground was shaking, and the terrifying power fluctuations made everyone in the airport tremble. In the control room, Wang Qingyuan also saw the scene through the monitoring screen immediately. The expression on his face trembled, and he stood up suddenly and said, is he really crazy? Fighting 3 powerful masters of the God of Law at the same time. But Lin En still stood there, motionless. The breeze blew his hair, and he said slowly, do you still think you are still the God of War and God of Law in your prime? 100 years have passed, and you are now about to be buried. Do you really think you can still maintain your fighting power back then? The next moment, Lin An suddenly raised his head, and a fierce purple light flashed in his eyes. Stop joking. Instantly, Lin An threw a heavy punch at the old man who was rushing towards him. On his arm, hundreds of wheels symbolizing power instantly lit up. Amid the roar of the Lion King, their fists collided. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 183. The two fists collided like two fully loaded trucks. The blasts spread out directly from the two of them, and the stone slabs on the ground were immediately swept up by the wind and waves and flew in all directions. But at that moment, the faces of everyone who saw the scene changed. The Lion King's face changed even more. He felt that his fist was hit by a planet. The huge force spread along his fingers, to the back of his hand, to his entire forearm, and finally to his shoulder. Crack! A series of extremely crisp sounds. The bones of his entire right arm were crushed into countless fragments in an instant under the crushing force. With a shrill scream, his body was thrown directly to the back by the huge impact force. At the same time, his entire right arm was constantly dismembered and shattered in the air. A loud bang. His body hit the ground heavily in the shocked eyes of the people around him, and the ground under him collapsed directly in the huge impact. Instantly, the whole audience trembled. Everyone's eyes fell on Lin An in the rolling dust. He still kept the posture of punching. What was frightening was that his body did not move at all. In other words, in this terrifying head-on collision, the Lion King did not even shake him by a centimeter. This was a pure crushing of power. The next moment, in the huge pit created by the collision, the Lion King covered his bloody shoulder and screamed loudly. He kept rolling on the ground, and the intense pain made his expression completely distorted. How is this possible? Ghost Witch Shangyangji trembled as he looked at the Lion King with a broken arm. He knew the Lion King very well. He became famous for his strong physical fitness and strength. Among so many people, he was the one whose blood and chi were exhausted the slowest. Even though he was old, once he transformed, his strong power was still as strong as before. You can say that. In the savior group they later formed, there were many who could kill him, but there were only a few who could take his punch head-on without losing. But how is this possible? He turned around and looked at Lin En. His eyes had changed. Lin En, as far as he knew, was only 25 years old now, and he became famous only a few months ago in the insect swarm incident. Although his strength was strong at that time, in his opinion, it was far from being able to crush their group of people. Although they are no longer in the god level, their foundation is still there, and they can still rank among the top town generals. But this can never be a reason for being crushed. How could he know that Lin En had obtained all the power of that small world, and his mental strength and physical fitness were sublimated at that moment? And the most important thing is the amplification of Lin En's hundreds of power wheels. When he was only an intermediate warrior, he could directly punch with the power of a master with the amplification of power. Not to mention now that his control over the will of law has greatly increased, he can easily punch 1,000 times more power. Lin En slowly retracted his fist, and there was no trace of emotion in his eyes under the hood. He slowly said, "I have said that you are not my opponent. Whether you come one by one or together, the final outcome is the same." Shangyangji suddenly gritted his teeth, stared at him, and said, "You? Who are you?" Lin En slowly drew out the white sword from his waist. His movements were very slow. Every time the white sword was drawn out an inch, the will of law on it was activated a little. When he drew out the white sword, the will of law on the sword had been fully activated. Lin An lowered his eyes slightly, looked at the blade, and said, "Didn't I say it? I'm here to kill you, don't you understand?" Instantly, Lin An raised his head. Shang Yongji felt the hairs on his body stand up, especially when he met Lin An's gaze. He felt a huge sense of oppression coming towards him. What kind of eyes are those? Under the cover of the purple light, indifferent without a trace of emotion, when you look at him, it's like looking at an abyss, a huge abyss. And the next moment, his face changed drastically. Because he saw that Lin An moved. He held the sword in his hand, and his figure was so fast that he even left a trail of after images on the spot. In that moment, it was really just that moment, even before he had time to mobilize the magic power of his body, Lin An's figure had already appeared in front of him. The sword in his hand suddenly made a loud hum sound. When the sword cut through the air, he could even clearly see the fission of the surrounding space. The mere existence of the sword caused the space under pressure to collapse. At that moment, he truly felt the threat of death. "I'll help you." The venomous snake roared, and in a 10,000th of a second, its figure appeared in front of him, and the two grim daggers in its hands instantly burst out with a pale green light. On the field, the only one who could see Lin An's movements clearly was him. He was famous for his dexterity and speed, and only he could keep up with Lin An's unparalleled speed. But it was just barely. The next moment, his daggers crossed, and he was about to resist the extreme attack for the ghost witch Shang Yongji. Lin An's eyes suddenly became sharp, and he said, "What's the use?" The next moment, the white sword in Lin An's hand fell on the two daggers. There was almost no suspense. The two daggers, which were made of top-grade materials, had countless cracks the moment they came into contact with Lin An's white sword. They didn't even cause any hindrance to the white sword. In the unbelievable eyes of the venomous snake, the dagger in his hand exploded into countless fragments with a bang. And the white sword in Lin An's hand also instantly enlarged in their pupils. Puff! Puff! Two sounds of swords entering the flesh came. For a moment, the whole audience was silent. Everyone was trembling as they watched the scene. The ghost witch and the viper stood there one after the other. The white sword in Lin An's hand directly pierced through Viper's chest, and then pierced through Viper's back, and once again pierced through the ghost witch Shang Yongji. One sword killed two people. This scene almost frightened everyone present. The two top town commanders were crushed to death in this short confrontation. This terrifying power made everyone feel boundless fear in their hearts. On the control tower, Wang Qingyuan trembled as he watched the scene in the picture, muttering. One sword killed two top town commanders in a second. Is he really Lin An? I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 184. No one could answer him. Under the gaze of everyone, Lin An suddenly pulled out the white sword from their chests. A choking noise came out of their throats, the light in their eyes faded, and their bodies fell heavily to the ground. The bloody blood spread from their chests, dyeing the surrounding ground red. Lin An sheathed the sword, and the wind blew through his black robe. What no one saw was that the souls of the two people turned into long streams and were instantly absorbed by the Kylan jade heart on Lin An's chest. Under the gaze of everyone, he walked out of the airport without looking back, and the next moment, a bloody swarm of insects suddenly surged above the sky. Those insects fell from the sky, instantly squatted on the two corpses, and ate them cleanly. The Lion King who fell in the deep pit was also covered by the insects in the midst of a shrill scream, and was swallowed up bit by bit until not even a bone was left. Although the blood and chi in these people's bodies have declined, they were once god-level beings. For the Zerg, they are still a very delicious meal. The whole place was silent. Wang Qingyuan looked at the screen of the last monitor outside the airport. In the screen, Lin An stood there, with a black robe flowing, like a god of death walking in the dark. Who is he? Wang Qingyuan lost his mind. He had never seen such a terrifying existence in his life. At this moment, his mobile phone rang. He quickly picked up the phone and saw that the number on it was the number that his superiors had given him before and asked him to report at all times. "Hello," he quickly answered the channel. A voice without any emotional fluctuations came from the other end of the phone. "Their location." In an instant, Wang Qingyuan suddenly turned his head and looked at the surveillance screen, and his face finally showed a shocked expression. Because he saw that in the picture, it was Lin En who was holding the phone at this moment. It was Lin En. This number was his. The person that the superiors wanted them to obey was him. He hurriedly said, Lin En, is that you? I am from the Qingcheng Intelligence Department." Location. The voice only said these two words and interrupted him. Wang Qingyuan quickly turned his head and yelled to the intelligence personnel behind him. "Quick! Send our monitoring information to this number immediately." Immediately. The intelligence personnel behind him finally woke up from their shock, but they still couldn't believe that it was Lin En who attacked those people this time. They immediately returned to their work and kept screening the latest news. For some reason, they suddenly felt a little excited in their hearts. Because they actually saw the scene when the legendary figure took action. That sword moved them and made them more curious and awed about the mysterious man. What kind of terrible person is he? Outside the airport, Lin En hung up the phone and raised his head to the sky. Under the dark hood, his eyes were like purple stars. 5. The next moment, he soared into the sky and disappeared in the night sky in an instant. He had received news from the intelligence personnel that the second group of people who arrived were flying towards Qingcheng on their private plane. But Lin En did not intend to stay here and wait for them. He had to strike first. These people were not only his targets, but also the best nutrients. In other places, there were few opportunities to kill the top town generals and the gods of law. Their souls and bodies improved him, which was the best among all the people he had killed. He couldn't wait. What no one knew was, in another direction, a train to Qingcheng was speeding in the night sky, making a series of buzzing sounds. This train came from a first-level main city in the north, passing through more than a dozen cities, and was about to arrive in Qingcheng. And in the monitoring of the Chen family intelligence personnel, this train also carried several members of the Savior group. In the calm sky, no one noticed that. A woman in a white robe stood in the mist, her thick hood covering her entire face, revealing only her breathtaking eyes. She also held a sword in her fair hands. A water blue blade that looked like it was carved from pure ice, and the biting cold even covered the hand holding it with frost and icicles. The floating clouds around condensed into frost and drifted in the air the moment they approached the sword. If the members of the Savior saw this sword, they would definitely find that this sword was the sword in the hands of the woman who suddenly appeared in the world 100 years ago and gave them power. The extremely cold sword that represented the desolate end of the last era. And the next moment, the woman moved. She looked down at the train below and swung the blade in her hand. At that moment, the sharp sound of the sword resounded through the sky. The entire sky froze instantly as the sword was swung. Even the air condensed into fine white frost wherever she swung. Boom! With a loud bang, the train was frozen on the ground from beginning to end in the cold light of the ice sword. The passengers in the train looked out the window in shock, and no one knew what had happened. But this scene immediately attracted the attention of the old men in the train. They were sitting in the same carriage, and at the moment the train was frozen, they all opened their eyes, and a chilling cold light burst out of their eyes. Something happened. And the next moment, there was a loud bang. The carriage they were in was instantly split in half by the sword light, and the people in the carriage screamed and left their seats and fled. The whole train fell into chaos at that moment. Who is it? The 5 old men stood up suddenly, and the blood and chi fluctuations burst out all over their bodies. They had already felt the piercing murderous intent. The murderous intent that came from all directions, so piercing that it even froze their bones. The next moment, the carriage in front of them suddenly broke open. The woman holding the cold sword in her hand fell from the sky and appeared in front of them. At that moment, all five of them stood up and looked at the woman who suddenly appeared with trembling eyes. "Who are you?" One of the old men stepped back and stared at the woman. But at that moment, their hearts were suddenly shocked, especially after seeing the woman's whole body attire. The shock came like a tide. A white robe, holding a cold sword, and a pair of thrilling eyes. Just like when the woman first appeared in front of them 100 years ago, she appeared, and then gave them hope and strength, and then they were frantically hunted down and killed by them decades later. At that moment, all five of them fell into a trance, and the trembling and shaking in their eyes became more and more intense. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 185. Master Qingxian, this is impossible, aren't you dead? They retreated tremblingly. Countless memories kept replaying in their minds, and the peerless figure of the past kept overlapping with the woman who suddenly appeared in front of them. Death. Betrayal. The image of that woman, at that moment, dug up the memories that they had buried in their hearts and tried desperately to forget. It was at that moment that the woman suddenly raised the sword in her hand. Her eyes were beating with piercing murderous intent, and in the murderous intent, there were faint tears that made people full of hatred. "Finally, I can kill them with my own hands, mother." In an instant, the piercing cold light enveloped the wilderness of hundreds of miles, and the train instantly turned into an ice sculpture on the endless wasteland, and in that train, a war of revenge began like that. At the same time, in the distant night sky, a private passenger plane rumbled in the sky at an altitude of 10,000 meters. In the passenger plane, 4 old men sat on their seats with their eyes closed. None of them spoke, as if they didn't exist. They were very old, and each of them had wrinkles on his face. 100 years ago, the 4 of them were all good friends who talked about everything. In those passionate years, they also worked hard for the great cause of the human race in this era. But everything will change. Especially people. After the dream of becoming a world-class god of law was shattered, their hearts had undergone tremendous changes. Especially when they decided to attack the mentor who gave them power, they had betrayed everything they had insisted on in the past. So every time they gathered together, they didn't say a word. Because the moment they saw each other, they would recall the cruel and inhuman expressions on their faces back then. The expression of drinking human blood. At this moment, suddenly, the satellite phone in the arms of an old man rang. He slowly opened his eyes, picked up the phone, looked at the number, and said solemnly, "Hello, this is Shang Qiu, what's the matter?" An anxious voice came from the other end of the phone instantly. "Quick! Get off the plane now! Someone is killing us! The Ghost Witch and the Lion King who arrived in Qingcheng have been killed. Just 2 minutes ago, Yun Kiguang and the other 5 people who were on the train to Qingcheng were also dead. Your whereabouts have been exposed. Quick, get out of there now!" Hearing the anxious voice on the phone, the other 3 old men also opened their eyes instantly, with a gloomy light in their eyes. Shang Qiu said solemnly, "What are you kidding? They are all top town generals, who has the ability to kill them?" The voice on the phone said anxiously, "You'd better believe me. I have received news that the person who killed the Ghost Witch and others is now heading in your direction. Get out." Shang Qiu narrowed his eyes and said, "One person? Such a ridiculous thing, dare to joke about it?" The voice said angrily, "You will regret it." And at the moment he finished speaking, his phone immediately heard a violent noise, and suddenly, the whole plane shook violently. The 3 old men frowned suddenly, all stood up and shouted, "What's going on?" The crew's anxious voice came from the front. "Something is wrong. We don't know what's going on." Our plane didn't detect any reason, and was suddenly wrapped in a red fog. We are investigating. If there were someone outside the plane, they would be able to see it clearly. The whole sky was wrapped in scarlet fog. The plane was like a headless fly in the scarlet fog. All navigation equipment failed. Shang Qiu suddenly realized that something was wrong. He immediately came to the window and looked outside. His face changed suddenly. That was not fog at all, but insects, an endless and dense swarm of insects. And at this moment, they suddenly heard a loud noise from the top of the plane. The next moment, they heard a loud cracking sound, and they suddenly raised their heads, only to see a hand directly penetrate the top of the machine, and with a loud piercing sound, a huge hole was directly torn in the iron sheet of the top of the machine. A huge airflow instantly poured in, sweeping everything inside and blowing it into the outer space. The faces of the four old men changed drastically. Above the gap, a man in a pitch-black robe stood there. Under the strong wind, his black robe was dancing, but his eyes were calm without a trace of ripples. "We found you." The four old men almost instantly distanced themselves from Lin En, who suddenly appeared, and their eyes instantly burst into an extremely ferocious light. "Who are you?" Shang Qiu gritted his teeth and said word by word. The man in the black robe slowly landed in the plane, flexed his wrist, and said slowly, "My name is Lin En." Shang Qiu's eyes narrowed suddenly, and he said, "What do you mean?" Lin En raised his head and said expressionlessly, "I'm already standing in front of you, don't you understand? Of course I'm here to kill you, do you have any last words?" Shang Qiu's heart suddenly shook. He suddenly remembered what the person on the phone had told him just now. He suddenly raised his head, stared at Lin En, and said, "You killed Shang Yongji and the others?" Lin En said lightly, "Yes, and you will meet again soon. I won't say any more nonsense. After killing you, there are still many people waiting for me to kill, so I will kill you within 2 minutes." In an instant, Lin En raised his head, and a bright light burst out from his purple eyes. The next moment, the plane shook violently. The four old men instantly felt a huge gravitational force pulling them to crawl to the ground. The gravitational force was so strong that it even made it extremely difficult for them to stand up. Shang Qiu's face changed drastically, and he said, "What did you do?" Lin En said calmly, "We are now at an altitude of 10,000 meters, but we will soon fall down at a speed of 5,000 meters per second. Good luck to you." Just as he finished speaking, the entire plane was instantly pulled directly to the ground by a huge force. Under the huge centrifugal force, the entire plane spun around. The airport was filled with shrill alarms and screams. In the cockpit, the captain looked at the speed of their descent on the instrument in horror. In that short second, their descent speed accelerated to 5,000 meters per second, which is 18,000 kilometers per hour. Almost in the next moment, their plane was pulled down from the sky 10,000 meters high. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 186. Boom. There was a huge crash. There wasn't even any firelight or any debris flying. Because the moment the plane hit the ground, the plane was directly crushed into pieces under the pressure of huge gravity. Above the silent wasteland, the fog in the sky gradually dispersed. If someone looked down from the sky at this moment, he would be able to clearly see that a huge pit with a diameter of hundreds of kilometers appeared on the wasteland. The pit is so deep that the deepest part of the pit cannot even be seen from the sky. Lin's use of the gravity wheel has become more and more proficient, especially now that his mental power has been greatly improved. He has been able to easily build thousands of times the gravity wheel. On the edge of the huge pit, under the cover of a dark robe, Lin stood there and glanced towards the bottom of the pit. Then he turned his head without looking back, stretched out his hand casually, and said, "Leave it to you." Boom! From the sky, a torrent of thunder and lightning with a diameter of hundreds of miles fell from the sky, instantly submerging the entire pit. The violent lightning even made the entire land tremble. The moment the lightning disappeared, the swarm of scarlet worms covering the sky instantly poured into the huge pit. They are excited and excited. The soul is absorbed by Lin En, and the body belongs to them. Their strength is improving step by step. A whole night. In one area after another around Xinjiang, news of the death of Savior members continued to come. The Chen family's top intelligence department continuously reports on the further development of the incident. The latest information is that target number 4, target number 21, and target number 35 we are responsible for monitoring are dead. At 1:21 in the morning, targets number 65, target 71, and target 72 were killed 300 kilometers outside Xinjiang. Intelligence confirmed. At 1:30 in the morning, target number 77, target number 52, and target number 32 were killed at the Xinjiang train entrance, intelligence confirmed. The staff were busy non-stop, and one piece of information was reported to the highest command center in Chengdu. In the conference room of the Chen family late at night, Chen Daoming and more than a dozen Dharma gods from the Chen family were sitting at the conference table, watching the news of death constantly coming on the screen. Chen Daoming's eyes were particularly penetrating. "It's simply unimaginable," a magic god murmured, "so many top generals were wiped out in the hands of Lin En and the eldest lady, just like chopping melons and vegetables. Could it be said that these are the true strengths of the two most powerful geniuses among the young generation in our Kyushu region?" Everyone present felt waves of trembling and excitement in their hearts. The reason for trembling is that their strength and growth rate are too fast, so fast that they have even reached the point where they are beyond their reach. What is exciting is that the two most powerful young masters of the contemporary era now belong to their Chen family. A Dharma god turned his head and looked at Chen Daoming's expression. He was sitting there, but the expression on his face was not a little bit excited or happy. Instead, his eyes were getting deeper and deeper. "Mr. Chen Daoming," the Dharma god asked hesitantly, "what's wrong with you? Aren't you happy that you can avenge your mistress?" Chen Dao raised his head, leaned on the seat, and looked at the ceiling with an indescribably complicated expression. "Do you think I should really be happy?" All the Dharma gods around him looked over, puzzled. Chen Daoming looked deeply at the ceiling and said, "If you stand from my personal point of view, I should be happy when a big revenge is taken, but if you stand from the point of view of the 9 provinces." He closed his eyes and said, "We lost hundreds of top generals and Dharma gods overnight. This has to be said to be a heavy blow to our Jiuzhou region. There are not many strong people in the world. Jiuzhou territory has lost so many top-level combat forces, and our status in the world may really be shaken." The strong men around were all startled. They swore that they had never thought about this. But when Chen Daoming mentioned it, they suddenly realized that the truth might be what he said. No matter what kind of power struggle and regime transfer occurs within the Kyushu region, no matter there are life and death factional struggles within the Kyushu region, in the eyes of foreigners, they still belong to the Kyushu region as a whole. But at this moment, they raised their heads and looked at the news of death that kept coming. For the Chen family, this is a complete victory, but for the Jiuzhou territory, in a sense, it is indeed a very serious loss. It is conceivable that once the news spreads that these more than 100 top towns will be eliminated, the status of the Kyushu region's superpower in the world realm will be greatly affected. They looked at Chen Daoming's face and felt even more how terrifying this man was. Even when a big revenge is about to be avenged, his inner vision and vision far exceed everyone else's. His eyes are always on the world. In the future, he will be the well-deserved number 1 person in the 9 provinces. "Then what will we do next?" a mage asked worriedly. Chen Daoming closed his eyes and said, although their deaths will indeed have a huge impact on our Zhuzhou territory, if their deaths can be used to consolidate the status of Lin En and Kemeng in the world, come down, that may not be a kind of compensation for our Zhuzhou territory, but what I am most worried about now is not their strength. He slowly opened his eyes, looked at the table absent-mindedly, and said, "It's about whether they can be recognized by the world and whether they can become the new watchmen of our Zhuzhou region in the world. Although those 100 top town generals have a blood feud with my Chen family, although their strength has now declined. It's not as good as it was back then, but the prestige they achieved 100 years ago is still shocking the world." He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and said, "The new god has come to power and the old god has been put to death. In this era of handover, I'm afraid another unimaginable bloody storm will break out." Outside Qingcheng, with a huge explosion, another member of the Savior turned into a cold corpse under Lin's sword. The old man's soul was once again absorbed by the Kylin Jade heart on his chest. After absorbing the souls of dozens of top generals, Kylin Jade heart is now as scarlet as blood. Under the transformation of Kylin Jade heart, their souls have now turned into billowing spiritual power, continuously expanding the upper limit of Lin An's spiritual power. Every time he kills someone, his strength will skyrocket. In just one night, his strength increased a lot again, and he was completely different from before. Lin En, who had absorbed a large amount of souls, his eyes were already filled with purple light. He slowly picked up the phone and said, "The next person's position. I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 187. The voice of the highest leader of the intelligence organization soon came from the phone. "Report to Venerable Lin En, we have detected that 3 powerful people of the Savior group were originally on a passenger plane heading to Qingcheng, but we just got the latest news that the passenger plane suddenly changed its course and is now flying towards the east coast. Where they are going needs further investigation. Their coordinates are." Lin En hung up the phone. He raised his head and looked at the night sky in the east, his eyes slowly narrowed. Obviously, those people must have received the news of the death of other members of their gang, which is undoubtedly an alarm for them. They will not come to Qingcheng anymore. Because they already know that a net has been set up in Qingcheng waiting for them. If they come here, there is only one way to die. So. He walked towards the east step by step, then jumped lightly and flew into the night sky. He drove the strong wind and disappeared in the night sky in an instant. "Since you are not coming, let me chase you. As long as you are in Zhuzhou, you will never escape Lin En's pursuit." This has actually turned into a hunt. Almost at the same time. In another direction of Qingcheng. The cold wind rustled, and the cold moon was in the sky. A car was burning in the wilderness, and it seemed that it had just exploded not long ago. And judging from the explosion, the car seemed to be torn in half by a sword. On the wilderness, the bodies of old men were lying on the ground with broken limbs and arms, and the scarlet blood almost burned the surrounding ground. And in the blood, a woman holding a cold sword staggered out. She kept panting, and the pale robe had long been stained with scarlet blood. But that was not her blood, but the blood of the dead souls who died under her sword. 31 have been killed. She raised her head with force, looking towards the east, with an extremely determined light in her eyes. Because as soon as she closed her eyes, she would remember the tragic scene when her mother died. The obsession of revenge has been deeply rooted in her heart and has tortured her for 10 years. She is looking forward to this day all the time. At this moment of revenge, she will use the sword in her mother's hand to kill them all one by one. Until death. The next moment, she gritted her teeth and rode the storm into the sky. No one can escape, and everyone will pay the price of blood for this. East. The sky was full of dark clouds, and the rolling fog almost covered the entire sky. And in this fog, a passenger plane was flying in it at a very high speed. In the cabin, 5 old men sat solemnly on their seats, their brows were frowning, and there was a crazy light flashing in their eyes. "I think you already know about the matter." An old man raised his head and said solemnly. "More than 100 of us were defeated one by one on the way to Qingcheng in just a few hours. Except for those who were not attracted by the news, all those who went to Qingcheng were already dead. His name is Li Changfeng. 100 years ago, his strength and potential were enough to rank among the top 10 in Zhuzhu domain. But fate made people laugh. In the next few decades, geniuses emerged from all sides, and he, who was a peerless man at that time, was also pushed down one by the rising stars. After failing to impact the world-class martial god, his body was severely damaged, and his blood and chi plummeted. As time went on, his strength continued to decline, and soon he fell out of the first echelon of Zhuzhu domain. This also became his biggest motivation for planning Ji Qingxian back then. The other old man sitting opposite him raised his head, narrowed his eyes, and said, "Did Chen Daoming do it himself? In the past 10 years, he has tried every means to squeeze our living space. If there is anyone in Zhuzhu who wants to get rid of us the most, it is only him who has this idea and the ability to do so." "No," Li Changfeng said gloomily, "it's the other two people." "Who?" The other old men raised their heads. Li Changfeng's eyes flashed with murderous intent, and he said, "One is Chen Daoming's eldest daughter Chen Qimeng, and the other is Lin En, who became famous in the insect swarm incident a few months ago." As soon as these words came out, the faces of the old men around him changed instantly, and they all showed stunned expressions. "What a joke!" An old man stood up suddenly, glaring at them and said, "They are just two juniors, how could they possibly fight against us and kill so many of us? Li Changfeng, I tell you, this is not the time to joke. If Chen Daoming hadn't taken action himself, who would have the ability to kill so many of us in such a short time?" Li Changfeng said solemnly, "This is the news I got, it's accurate. That Chen Qimeng killed 30% of us, and Lin En killed 70% of us alone. I summoned you here to tell you that we are being targeted by the two of them. If we don't gather together, we will all die." The old men around gritted their teeth and stared at Li Changfeng's face. They believed that Li Changfeng would never joke about such things, but it was too absurd for them to believe that the deaths of so many of them were all caused by two young men. After a long time, the old men around gritted their teeth and said suddenly, "So what do you say, what should we do now? Are you going to take us to flee overseas? I tell you, Li Changfeng, we were all well-known figures in Zhuzhu domain back then. Even if we die, we will never run away." The old men around all reconsidered, their eyes flickered, and the light of anger danced in their eyes. It was like an offense. The strong men of the previous generation were slaughtered by the younger generation like killing chickens and dogs. This was simply the greatest insult to them. Li Changfeng stood up slowly and said solemnly, "Escape? Of course we won't escape. Lin En and Chen Qimeng are now known as the most talented and powerful young geniuses in Zhuzhu. They are also the future of his Chen family who can replace Chen Daoming to rule the world. If we can kill them, it will definitely be a heavy blow to Chen Daoming." An old man narrowed his eyes, and the murderous intent in his eyes flashed. "You mean, we kill them?" Li Changfeng said solemnly, "That's right. To be honest, the East Coast is my territory that Li Changfeng has been operating for hundreds of years. There are many strong men under my command, and I have notified the people of our generation who are still alive. If they really want to kill them all, then they will definitely track us down. Then we will set up a net for them and make them come back without a return." Li Changfeng stood up suddenly, and with a palm, the seat next to him was directly slapped into powder. The other elders all stood up, squinted their eyes, and said, "Okay. We listen to you. If we really lose to the younger generation, we will be the laughing stock of the world. We will never agree to it." Li Changfeng was about to speak. But at this moment, An emotionless voice suddenly sounded in the cabin like a ghost. Are you done? If you are, you can go to hell. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 188. In an instant, the expressions of all the old men around him changed drastically. They suddenly turned their heads and shouted in the direction of the sound. Who is it? Get out of here. But there was no one in the cabin at all. And at this moment, an old man's eyes glanced outside the window inadvertently. In an instant, his expression changed drastically. He pointed out the window and said, "There's someone there." Instantly, they turned and looked out the window. I saw a man wearing a black robe standing on the right wing of the plane. The violent airflow blew through his robe, but it was unable to shake their bodies in the slightest. The speed of their plane has now reached 1,500 kilometers per hour, but despite this, the man can still stand on the wing, which is enough to show his power. The next moment, the man turned his head, and in the roaring wind, they saw the man's face clearly. Lin, the expressions of the old men around him suddenly changed. They were still discussing him just now. Who would have thought that he would be standing outside their plane? When did he come? Why didn't they feel it at all? And at the next moment, they suddenly saw Lin En raising his head, showing an expressionless face. Under their extremely horrified gaze, he grabbed the wing of their plane. In an instant, they felt a huge centrifugal force. Under their trembling gaze, Lin En actually grabbed their plane while flying at a speed of more than 1,000 kilometers per hour, and then directly broke away from their plane. The channel. Then he threw it directly towards the ground. This rough and direct method instantly caused the old man in the cabin to roar. They never imagined that they would be calculated in such a shameful way. Warning! Warning! The passenger plane is out of balance and is falling, 8,672 meters above the ground. Warning! Passengers, please be sure to fasten your seat belts. The plane has stalled and is now 4,325 meters above the ground. Warning! Police! In the cities along the east coast, people raised their heads in shock. They could clearly see an unbalanced plane, with blazing fire, suddenly hovering over their city. Under the gaze of countless people, the plane crossed the horizon and hit the eastern sea heavily. The huge wave from the explosion was even 100 meters away. At the same time, on the other side of the sky, the woman in a white robe also saw the scene of the plane flying across the sky. She raised her head in a daze and looked towards the higher sky. At that moment, she faintly caught a figure. A black figure standing 10,000 meters in the sky, looking down at the world beneath her feet. His eyes were particularly indifferent. But in just that moment, like a silhouette, the man's figure disappeared there. Kimeng was startled. For no reason, she actually felt a violent tremor somewhere in her heart. The next moment, she immediately adjusted her thoughts, turned her head suddenly, and her eyes became clear again, with murderous intent bursting out of them. She knew that now was definitely not the time to think about this. Because there are still people waiting for her to kill. In an instant, she soared into the sky and shot towards the eastern sea. In the sea, the crashed plane was burning with blazing fire above the sea. Big waves came one after another. The next moment, one figure after another rushed up from below the sea level and stood above the sea level. They were all wet, looked particularly embarrassed, and the expressions on their faces were even more ferocious. Li Changfeng suddenly raised his head and roared. "Lin, come out." They have never been as embarrassed as they are now. Someone threw the entire plane directly from the sky. This insulting and contemptuous method is the greatest shame for them. Who are they? He was called the savior by people back then. They are peerless strong men who have become famous during the period of spiritual energy recovery. They didn't wait for Lin En. The next moment, they saw a woman in a white robe in the direction of the coast. She was constantly warping space. Just now, the figure was still 100 miles away. At that moment, she had already arrived. Arrived in front of them. On top of the icy sea. The woman in white robe stood above the sea level, like a white ghost, her eyes fixed on the old men present. Li Changfeng instantly recognized Kimeng, who was wearing a white robe, and said with a ferocious expression. "It's you." Kimeng said deeply, "For 10 years, I have been thinking about killing you all the time. Now this opportunity has finally come." Li Changfeng gritted his teeth and said with blood-red eyes, "After killing your mother, we really should have killed you too. Do you want to take revenge on us? Then let us see, what do you have? No such ability." In an instant, Li Changfeng looked up to the sky and roared. The entire sea roared wildly, and hundreds of hectares of sea water were swept up into the sky by him in an instant, forming huge waves hundreds of meters high. "I want to see if you have inherited your mother's style and if you are worthy of the cold sword in your hand." Kimeng suddenly raised her head, murderous intent flashing through her eyes. The next moment, she suddenly swung the sword in her hand. The biting cold current spread out from her body, and the sea surface under her feet was instantly frozen. The biting cold current suddenly spread towards the huge waves. In an instant, the huge waves hundreds of meters high were directly frozen into ice sculptures by the cold current. "You killed my mother. Today I will make you pay with your lives." Tears flashed in Chi Meng's eyes, and in an instant she was as fierce as a demon from hell. 10 years. In these 10 years, no one knows what kind of great torment she has endured in her heart. Because at the beginning, she watched her mother die in front of her. And their purpose of not killing her was to torture her, so that she would witness the tragedy of her mother's death and let this pain accompany her for the rest of her life. Her body instantly turned into a residual image and rushed towards Li Changfeng, who was closest to her. With absolute hatred and murderous intent. Her sword blade came directly to Li Changfeng under the leap of tearing space. Puff! The sword blade slashed across Li Changfeng's shoulder, leaving a bloody cut on his body. The faces of the old men around changed drastically, and they roared and rushed towards Chi Meng. They were all great masters of the time. Although their blood and energy declined now, their combat experience was still very high. At that moment, Chi Meng had been blocked in all directions by them. Chi Meng, who lost her mind due to the murderous intent of revenge, did not care whether she would die here. Her sword turned over, and after injuring Li Changfeng, it suddenly slashed across the chest of another old man. The sword energy directly broke his ribs, causing blood to splash into the void. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. I can see the laws of things. Author, Yitiao Xuanhuan. Chapter 189. But at the same time, she was also hit hard. She was hit hard on the back, and she suddenly spit out a mouthful of blood, and her body flew hundreds of meters away. But even so, she took the palm and slashed the old man's arm with the sword. Blood splattered 5 steps. The shrill screams resounded through the sky. Chi Meng suddenly adjusted her body and stood above the sea level, panting. Killing 30 top town generals in a row has consumed too much of her energy. How many people in the world can achieve such an achievement? But this is already the limit, and she already feels blurred in front of her eyes. If it weren't for the obsession of revenge that still supported her, I'm afraid she would have fainted long ago. Li Changfeng looked at her fiercely, covering his wound, and said, "How dare you hurt me? How dare you make me bleed?" He raised his head suddenly, and dense blood-colored lines appeared all over his body in an instant. He was angry. He was completely enraged by Chi Meng. Anyone who knew him knew that when he, Li Changfeng, was possessed by blood veins all over his body, it was time for him to fight with all his strength. The blood veins were the embodiment of his life will. Once the blood veins were possessed, his strength and speed could be instantly improved in all directions, endlessly. Several other old men also roared, mobilizing their blood and energy, ready to kill. Although they were old, if they could not kill the young woman together, then they would be in vain. In an instant, the sky and the earth changed color. The whole sea was surging in the explosion of their blood and energy. Die! The next moment, Li Changfeng soared into the sky, like a prehistoric beast, and the blood and energy bursting out around him directly caused the space to collapse. Under the wrapping of that terrifying power, he rushed towards the woman. If Qi Men was really hit by this blow, I'm afraid her body would be shattered in an instant. Qimeng suddenly raised her head, with a chilling murderous intent flashing in her eyes. Even if she died, she would do her best to strangle them here. But the next moment, her face changed. I saw scarlet chains burst out from under the sponge, and instantly imprisoned her body in place. When the scarlet chains trapped him, she immediately felt that the surrounding space was blocked. How could it be? An old man gritted his teeth and said with bloodshot eyes, "Chen Qimeng, do you really think we have no way to deal with you? Do you still remember this blood curse chain? This is a forbidden technique that was specially developed based on your mother's bloodline in order to trap her mother. I never thought that I would use it again today. Die!" Chen Qimeng's heart suddenly shook. She suddenly raised her head, looking at Li Changfeng, who was getting closer and closer, and the unwillingness in her eyes became bigger and bigger. This was the method they used to deal with her mother, and now they are using it on her again. Is he going to die here today? The next moment, Li Changfeng's claws wrapped in blood were less than 100 meters away from Chen Qimeng. 100 meters away, in the eyes of these powerful people, is just a stone's throw away. Chen Qimeng, I'll take you to see your mother right now. Li Changfeng grinned, and his blood was almost stimulated to the maximum. For a moment, it seemed as if the world was silent. But at this moment, a cold voice suddenly came from the sky. What a poor martial arts! The faces of the old men around him changed instantly. But when they realized that something was wrong, it was too late. Boom! Suddenly, thunder surged in the sky. Just when Li Changfeng was about to cross the 100-meter distance, the sky seemed to collapse, and a rolling waterfall of thunder suddenly fell. Directly falling from the sky for tens of kilometers, the violent lightning even made the entire sea boil. The dazzling lightning almost enveloped Li Changfeng in that instant. Qi Meng stared blankly at the lightning, and Li Changfeng's flesh and bones were constantly peeling off, watching him scream miserably. It was like a punishment from heaven. The next moment, the thunder waterfall subsided. A huge hole was pierced through the sea. At the moment when the thunder waterfall disappeared, thousands of hectares of sea water poured back, forming a huge vortex in the huge hole. In an instant, the whole place was silent. The several old men looked at the scene tremblingly, and the huge trembling made their bodies stiff. Li Changfeng is dead. Even his body could not be found. His body had turned into ashes in the violent lightning. Who is it? Who is it? The next moment, all the old men raised their heads and looked up at the sky tremblingly. Chen Qimeng also raised her head in a daze and looked at the boundless night sky. It was a dark night with a cold wind. Just above the 1,000-meter high sky, they saw a man in a pitch-black robe. He stood there, looking down at them indifferently, his robe fluttering behind him, and countless scarlet insects surrounded him, making joyful and ferocious hisses. Like a god, standing tall in the heavens. In an instant, the old men felt as if all the blood in their bodies had coagulated. Lin En, they subconsciously said the name, and their bodies trembled as they retreated. They themselves didn't know why they were so scared when they saw him, but they vaguely felt an unmatched power from him. It was like the fear of an ant looking at a giant elephant. His power was even stronger. Chen Qimeng stared at the face in a daze. In an instant, the face slowly overlapped with the immature face that had stagnated in her memory several years ago. The next moment, in the sky, Lin En hugged his shoulders, looked down at them indifferently, and said, "Since you have seen me coming, you should also know what your ending will be." Lin En hugged his shoulders and said lightly, "Commit suicide, I can leave you a whole body." As soon as these words came out, the several old men trembled suddenly. The look in his eyes that did not regard them as human beings, and the words that were so confident that they were even regarded as a corpse. They could hear from Lin En's words that he had the ability to kill them, and the ability to crush them. Li Changfeng was the most powerful among them. But in the encounter just now, Li Changfeng was killed by this man. He didn't even have the ability to fight back, and died in his hands. They finally understood why Li Changfeng wanted to gather them together, because fighting against such a person alone, there was no chance of winning. But Li Changfeng was still wrong. Because when they really faced this man, they found that even if they gathered together, they might not be his opponent. The next moment, an old man turned his head suddenly and roared, "Run! Run! We are definitely not his." With a puff. Just as he finished speaking, a pale sword light suddenly flashed in his eyes. Lin En's body appeared behind them at the moment when he didn't react, and the sword in his hand crossed his neck. In an instant, his pupils suddenly dispersed. The next moment, his head fell off his neck and landed on the sea. Blood was gushing like crazy. Lin En slowly put away his sword and said, "Do you think there is a chance? I can see the laws of things." Author, Yitiao Xianyue. Chapter 190. Instantly, the eyes of the old men around were covered with fear. They roared, almost without any hesitation, and fled frantically in multiple directions in an instant. They even pushed their blood and energy to the extreme, just to be faster. Such a terrifying person. How can they fight him? He killed their two top town generals in one encounter. Staying here will only lead to death. A gust of wind blew up the robe behind Lin En. It was a battlefield of fighting just now, but in a blink of an eye, there were only two of them left. Chi Meng stared at the familiar and unfamiliar back in a daze. The moment she saw his face, she had confirmed that he was Lin En. He was her best companion and the best captain in Jianghai City back then. Lin En. Her expression was stunned, and the shock in her heart surged like a tide. For the past 2 years, she has been trapped in the manor of Chengdu by her father, almost completely cut off from the outside world. She didn't know what happened to Lin En in these years. She also didn't know how Lin En became famous in the Zerg incident a few months ago. Her impression of Lin En still remained at the moment when she left 2 years ago. She had a falling out with her father that year, and she ran away from home in anger, vowing to make a name for herself outside and have the power to take revenge. She went all the way south and came to Jianghai City, the southernmost city in Zhuzhou. There she changed her name to Bai and joined the army of Jianghai City. It was there that she met Lin En. They fought against ferocious beasts on the battlefield for many years and established an unbreakable friendship. She even knew in her heart that Lin En had long regarded her as the most important person in his life and as a lover. But 2 years ago, she still chose to leave Jianghai City and go north to avenge her mother. She knew that from that moment on, the relationship between the two of them had been severed. Long time no see, bye. The wind and waves slapped the reefs on the shore. Lin En held the sword in his hand, and the cloak behind him fluttered wildly. He did not look back. His dark back was like a reef standing forever on the sea. Chi Meng's eyes flashed with a trace of complexity. When he said this, she knew that the man in front of her was indeed the Lin En he knew. 2 years passed in a flash. But it was like a chasm between them. "You are different from before," Chi Meng said in a complicated way. Lin En turned his head slightly and said softly, "I have become stronger and have surpassed you." Chi Meng's eyelashes drooped slightly, and said, "You should have experienced a lot in the past 2 years. Lin En raised his head, and the sea breeze blew his hair. How can people grow without experiencing some hardships? Chi Meng looked at his back from a distance. Although his voice was still so peaceful, she felt the indifference in his tone. Do you still hate my decision 2 years ago? Chi Meng took a deep breath, her voice full of mixed feelings. Lin En smiled slightly, and said calmly, it's a peaceful breakup, so why hate it? Chi Meng suddenly felt a kind of bitter feeling rushing to the tip of her nose, but she soon smiled and stretched out her hand to wipe away the raindrops from the corner of her eyes. Yes. She knew that since she made that decision, the relationship between the two of them had been severed. Break up peacefully, say goodbye to passers-by, it's that simple. Everyone has long been an adult, why bother talking about those young love? But I still want to thank you, because you made me understand a truth. Lin En turned his head slightly, raised the corner of his mouth, and said. That is to let me know that if a person is not strong enough, he can't keep anything. No matter how you beg, it will be useless. In the end, it depends on whether you have enough strength. Chi Meng was startled, and her heart suddenly felt like being pricked by a needle. Lin En smiled slightly, soaring into the sky in the whistling wind, his voice echoing over the entire sea. As long as he has enough power, he can do whatever he wants and kill whoever he wants, just like me now. Don't you want revenge? I can help you, by the way. The next moment, in the howling wind, Lin En's figure instantly disappeared in the night sky. His ethereal voice came from afar. Let's go, at least now, our goals are the same. Kimeng suddenly felt a wave of weakness all over her body. She looked at Lin En's disappearing back for a long time, and her heart was stabbed again and again. The memories of the past that she had sealed for 2 years came rolling in like a tide. Lin En, please forgive me. She clenched the cold sword in her hand tightly, her eyes red, and suddenly soared into the sky. After this revenge is over, I hope to do my best to save our relationship. If it really can't be saved, please forgive me. Above the boundless sea, an old man covered in blood and with disheveled hair, ran like a madman towards the ocean. He looked like a madman, with sword marks all over his body, and he let out a shrill scream. The next moment, a sword rang. The ocean in front of him was instantly split from the center, and thousands of hectares of seawater rushed to both sides. The old man looked at the trench created by the sword with trembling eyes, and the trembling in his heart surged like a tide. The next moment, he suddenly turned his head, roared at the sky, and said, Lin En, you will be in trouble. In an instant, before he could finish his words, a sword light pierced through his neck and pierced through thousands of meters of seawater. His head flew up instantly and fell into the trench outside that was created by the sword. In the sky, Lin En stretched out his hand, and the pale sword blade suddenly soared into the sky and fell into his hand. One, Lin En said lightly. Chi Meng, who was following Lin En from a distance, stared at the scene in a daze. Her eyes lingered for a long time on the trench of 10,000 meters that was just created by Lin En's sword. It was just a sword, really just this simple sword. She didn't even feel that Lin En had consumed any energy. His mental strength and blood were extremely stable, and even his breath was so stable. Is this really the him in her memory? A few minutes later, hundreds of miles away in another sea area, Lin En calmly retracted the white sword. 2. And the fragmented body of an old man floated on the sea, and was instantly swallowed by the swarm of insects that fell from the sky. 3. A few minutes later, the old man who had fled to another direction before turned into a cold corpse in Lin En's hands again. 4. 5. Chi Meng followed him in a daze, watching him leisurely kill one top-town general after another. Every time he killed a person, he would read out a number. Those top strong men in the eyes of others were like pigs and dogs in his eyes. 2 years. It was only 2 years. What on earth did he go through that made him grow to such a terrible level in such a short time? Chi Meng stared at his back in a daze. Is he really the Lin An she once knew? Apart from his appearance and memories, she could hardly see any trace of him. Just as she was lost in thought, Lin An brushed past her like a black ghost, and his voice was like catkins in the wind. There is only one left, and then your revenge will be over. Chi Meng turned her head and looked at his back from a distance. Is there any possibility of redemption for us? Lin An did not look back, and his steps did not even pause for a moment, and the strong wind blew his robe. Unless time can flow backwards. In an instant, the sea breeze blew up the wind and rain unscrupulously. The falling raindrops wet Chi Meng standing on the sea level. She just stood there, looking at his back from a distance, until his figure disappeared at the invisible end.